So I was about to grudgingly review Terminator Genesis when I realized I can't talk about that movie without talking about everything else in the franchise. The Terminator is directed by James Cameron, co-written by him and Gail Ann Hurd, and stars Linda Hamilton, Michael Biehn, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. And in The Terminator, in the year 2029, humanity is all but wiped out by this thing called Skynet, which has created this robot army of Terminators, but there's a small group of human resistance fighters who are close to beating Skynet, so Skynet sends back this T-800 model Terminator cyborg, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, to kill the future mother of the resistance, Sarah Connor, played by Linda Hamilton. And the human resistance also sends back a soldier, Kyle Reese, played by Michael Biehn, in order to protect Sarah Connor. The Terminator, for a movie as old as it is, has fantastic visuals. The editing is excellent, and the directing from James Cameron, like he was a master from the very beginning. Now, like I said, for a movie released in 1984, the visual effects in The Terminator are excellent. You really shouldn't expect any less from the guy who would eventually bring us Avatar 25 years later. But CGI wasn't really a big thing in the 80s, obviously, so they really had to rely on prosthetics and green screen stop motion animation. All of that works so beautifully. They're not perfect, of course, by today's standards, but they really get the job done and help make the Terminator seem even scarier and more inhuman than you already thought it was, especially by the ending. When you begin to see stop motion animation, it's fantastic. It's really scary. And at the beginning of the movie, you also get to see glimpses of the future. And they really kind of blend animation with real sound stages and creates this really cool kind of bleak world, this barren world that really makes you feel claustrophobic and hopeless just through visuals alone. And for me, The Terminator really is a great example of how to pull off great production design and makeup effects that really kind of contribute to tone. And for me, like, that's such an achievement, especially with a tiny production budget of like $6 million. I mean, some of our movies nowadays with like $10 million, $100 million budgets can't pull this off. And for me, I want to highlight that it's not necessarily that the Terminator had iconic like costumes from the very beginning. I mean, Arnold's shades and black leather combination is kind of classic now, but you know, those aren't great costume pieces in themselves, but the quality of the movie itself and the characters are the ones that make these items memorable, and really kind of catapult them into iconic status. The cinematography from Adam Greenberg is really great as well, because it makes all these nighttime shots feel almost as bleak as the post-apocalyptic world we see at the beginning, but there's a certain beauty in it that only like neon-lit urban landscapes can achieve. Now, the Terminator sounds just as good in its gunfire and its destruction as any modern action blockbuster, but for me, like most great action movies, this movie also knows when to use silence very well, because I think it's important to note that this first film in the series is just as much a horror movie as it is a sci-fi action film. And sound for me is really horror's greatest weapon, and they use it so well here. There are certain moments where silence is employed to build tension rather than relieve it, which is a great technique that a lot of people still misuse. And for me, the music in this movie just has instant classic written all over it. The musical themes by Brad Fiedel, you know, the da-da-da-da-da, they're just so iconic at this point that when you hear them in the movie, you get chills, like you know what's coming. And his music really manages to capture like the technophobic aspect of the story, but also highlights certain scenes that are quieter, more human, and then goes back to like being really scary and really awe-inspiring. It's really, really great stuff. But we absolutely have to talk about the editing in this movie. Mark Goldblatt's editing is absolutely phenomenal. For me, this movie would have fallen apart if it weren't for him. His editing is just that good. The reason why the first 30 minutes or so of this movie works so well is because of Mark Goldblatt. Like, there are three separate character strands. At the beginning of this movie, you have Kyle Reese, Sarah Connor, and the Terminator, and there's barely any dialogue. You don't really know what these people's intentions are, but because of the editing that's so tight, through smart sequencing of shots, through visual markers, like, we're able to understand that they all are part of the same story, and they're all heading to the same destination, which is really cool. It still does leave things sort of ambiguous though, which is really cool, because we don't, exactly what I said, you don't really know who's going to shoot who or whatever. Like, it's so well edited, I think. But then the rest of the film also, for me, is just as good in terms of its editing. It really keeps you on the edge of your seats, especially during the horror sequences, but the action also is cut so well. It's so single track in the sense that there are lots of things happening, but the action is uncomplicated, it's easy to focus on. And in terms of acting, Linda Hamilton isn't badass yet, that's in Terminator 2. Here, she's pretty much the horror archetype of the final girl, but she plays it so well, you know, she's inherently very likable, and I think it was wise to kind of keep her frantic and scared throughout the entire movie instead of, you know, her doing like a 180 at the ending and becoming like really cool and badass, because for me that's just not believable, and I like that they kept it that way for the whole movie. For me, Michael Biehn's portrayal of Kyle Reese is so memorable because the character has like no idea how to talk to 20th century people, and it really shows he's so awkward trying to explain everything. But there's a lot of pain and vulnerability under his like tough exterior, and he manages to appear really hopeful at certain points, but in a kind of a tragic way. But if you want to talk about a standout performance, like this is arguably the role that made Arnold Schwarzenegger what he is now. This is like the epitome of a restrained performance. Like he could have been just emotionless the whole time, but he really adds just a tiny bit of menace to his performance, so you know he becomes very, very memorable. He's not just a robot, you know, he is a killing machine, and just the way he walks away, he keeps his face straight all the time, like you really get that impression. It's very, very impressive. And I also like the fact how James Cameron and Gale Anne Hurd use dialogue very sparsely in this movie. You could argue that a lot of the dialogue is very exposition heavy, especially coming from Kyle Reese. But the film smartly keeps us guessing for a bit to see if like Kyle Reese is crazy or not. But for me, like this exposition is forgivable because the premise that this movie builds itself on is just genius. Like for me, what they've done with this premise, like ignoring all the issues with time travel narratives and stuff, like they've created like the best version of a slasher movie ever. This is a slasher movie deep down, but it's constructed so well that all the unnecessary tropes are gone, you know, like they just boil it down, and it really, really works. But for me, the best thing about this movie is how James Cameron really turns this premise into a horror movie. It's so much more well directed than most horror movies I've seen in this century, and the action is very, very economic with no frills. It really works because the showdowns are, again, just boiled down to the essentials. There's really like an exclamation point added to every single shot, every single kill. And for me, the trademark of James Cameron's directing really is how straightforward his direction is without being brainless. You know, he's a master at making huge events the backdrop, and that takes care of the tone, but he focuses the story on individual characters, and they are the ones who make us care about the larger events. It's kind of a bottom-up approach, and it really, really works. The only real issue I have with Terminator is that there's some cheesy moments that for me betray the fact that this is James Cameron's first real movie after Piranha 2. Especially like the sex scene that happens, like it feels very 80s and very cheesy, but it's kind of like a small problem. So in the end, I would say that The Terminator is an awesome movie. It's essential viewing for sci-fi fans, for action fans, for horror fans even, and kind of an unpopular opinion. Most people say Terminator 2 is their favorite, but I personally think this is the best so far because of how straightforward it is, because of the horror aspect. Like, I really love this movie. Alright, so those were my thoughts on The Terminator. Have you guys seen it? What do you think about it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, whether you agree with me or not, please leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation.